Hello everyone, this is Mike History and welcome to, I believe, part 8 of the famous ancestors of King Charles. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, basically I'm doing a series looking at what would the results of King Charles's DNA test be. And so by doing this, I have looked at the ancestry of all his ancestors to come to this conclusion, and here are just some of the most famous or interesting ancestors that I have found. So, I would recommend, of course, watch the first video in the series and preferably watch the previous videos, but you do not strictly need them to understand this video. And last time we talked a lot about some of the late medieval Central European monarchs who Charles is descended from, and so now we will be moving into the time of the Renaissance and the Reformation. So we will start actually with Alfonso XI of Castile, who himself is not that remarkable, but he did have an illegitimate son with a noblewoman named Eleanor de Guzman, named Frederick Alonso. Frederick would continue the tradition by having his own illegitimate son named Alfonso Enriquez. But what makes him interesting is that he was actually half Jewish, because Frederick's mistress, Paloma Benyaya, was actually Jewish. Their great-granddaughter, Juana Enriquez, married John II of Aragon. Now, their son was the very famous Ferdinand II of Aragon, who became King of Sicily in 1468, and in 1475 married Isabella I of Castile, becoming the King of Castile and Leon. 4 years later, he succeeded his father John II as King of Aragon, Valencia, Sardinia, and Majorca, as well as Count of Barcelona. Due to this, he became the first real Spanish ruler, and his marriage created the beginning of Spain as we know it. He also became Count of Roussillon and Cerdagne in 1493, but after Isabella's death in 1504, her titles were passed on to his daughter Joanna, although he became King of Naples that year. Finally, in 1512, he became King of Navarre, now controlling all of Iberia except Portugal. Now, he was actually 41% Spanish and only 13% Aragonese, and was also 10.75% French and 8.75% German. However, despite being partially responsible for the expulsion of the Jews, as we have mentioned from the start of this video, he was actually a 16th Jewish himself. Now, he was also 4% Greek, 3% Cuman, 3% Occitan, 2.25% Dutch, 2% Sardinian, 1% Polish, 1% Ukrainian, 0.5% Swedish, Serbian, Armenian, and English, and 0.25% Czech, Hungarian, Sorb, Lombard, Catalan, and Breton. Now, of course, we can't mention Ferdinand without Isabella, his very famous wife and one of the most important monarchs of all time. She became Queen of Castile and Leon in 1474, and after a struggle to claim the throne, reorganized the government, lowering crime rates and paying off the debt her half-brother Henry IV had left behind. Of course, the most famous year of her reign was 1492, when she and Ferdinand finally completed the Reconquista, expelling the Muslims from Spain after capturing Granada, and mere months later paid for Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Indies, in which he discovered the Americas for the Europeans. This led to Spain becoming the most powerful country in the world and the first global empire ever. She was also responsible for the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition, and she and Ferdinand were known as Catholic monarchs. Interestingly enough, though, she was actually 29.25% Portuguese, 27.25% French, and only 13.75% Spanish. She was also 6.5% German, 5% Occitan, 4% Aragonese, 3.75% Greek, 3.75% Dutch, 1.25% Cuman, 1.25% Sardinian, 0.75% Leonese, 0.75% Lombard, 0.5% English, Breton, and Ukrainian, and 0.25% Catalan, Polish, Galician, Scottish, and Swedish. Now, funnily enough, despite being descended from the Catholic monarchs, Charles III is also descended from the first Protestant kings, with the first major break from the Catholic Church being initiated by another ancestor of his, Philip I Landgrave of Hesse. Now, he took that title in 1509, aged 5, but wouldn't really begin using his powers for another 10 years. He first met Martin Luther at the Diet of Worms in 1521, and was attracted by his personality, although it took him a while to take interest in his teachings. But after meeting the theologian Philip Melanchthon, he converted to Protestantism in 1524. However, he helped suppress the German Peasants' War the following year at the Battle of Frankenhausen, even though that rebellion was inspired by the Reformation. Nevertheless, he did take his conversion seriously, and in 1526 got to prove it by creating a defensive alliance with fellow Protestant John Elector of Saxony, and trying to prevent Ferdinand, the Catholic Archduke of Austria, from getting elected as Holy Roman Emperor. That year, at the Diet of Speyer, he openly embraced his new faith, allowing Protestants to preach there and openly disregarding Catholic services and traditions. In his country, he dissolved monasteries and founded the University of Marburg as a school for Protestant theologians. Because of this, he came into conflict with Ferdinand's brother, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, at the Diet of Augsburg in 1530. When Charles demanded that Protestants should stop teaching and participate in the Feast of Corpus Christi, Philip refused, and the following year created the Schmalkaldic League to protect Protestant countries' interests against Charles. Although he tried to achieve some of his goals peacefully, he prepared himself for war and constantly looked for new allies. When the war did break out in 1534, he defeated Archduke Ferdinand at the Battle of Laufen, causing Ferdinand to lose Württemberg and making Philip a Protestant hero. Although he later reconciled somewhat to Charles, after Catholic Duke Henry V of Brunswick-Luneburg tried to conquer his lands, he tried to create a new Protestant alliance. In 1546, Charles banned him as a rebel, causing the Schmalkaldic War to break out, but the defeat at the Battle of Mühlberg the following year caused Philip to lose the war, and he was captured, not being released until the Peace of Passau in 1552. Although he was now more open to Catholicism, his main goal was still maintaining Protestant unity, trying to reconcile Calvinists and Lutherans, and aiding the Protestants in the French wars of religion. His final legacy was completely reorganizing the Hessian Church, and he died in 1567. Now, this vigorous Protestant hero was 83% German, 10.5% Polish, 2.5% French, 1.25% Swedish, 1% Greek, 0.5% Russian, 0.5% Dutch, and 0.25% Norwegian, Cuman, and Hungarian. Now, only 1 year after his conversion, another German ruler converted to Protestantism, thus ensuring his state's eventual rise to dominance. That man was Albert, who became the Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights in 1510, but after his conversion in 1525 became the first Duke of Prussia, and he made it the first official Protestant country in the world. His confiscation of church property allowed him to pay for his court. He also embraced his new religion, joining Philip's League of Torgau the following year, and plotted to overthrow Charles V alongside him, after he demanded that all princes become Catholic in 1548. He was also a promoter of education and culture, establishing schools in every town. But because of a lack of funding, he raised taxes, which caused a peasant rebellion. Although by his death in 1568 he lost much power, he laid the foundations for the emergence of Prussia and later Germany, which changed all of world history. Despite this, he was actually only 40.5% German, with the rest being 11.5% Lithuanian, 6.75% Russian, 6.75% French, 6.5% Belarusian, 3.5% Venetian, 3.5% Greek, 2.5% Dutch, 2.25% Ligurian, 1.75% Ukrainian, 1.5% Polish, Lombard, Bosniak, and Swedish, 1.25% Piedmontese, 1.25% Czech, 1% Cuman, 1% Emilian, 0.75% Danish, 0.75% Sorb, 0.5% Kashubian, English, and Serbian, and 0.25% Occitan, Sardinian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian. So, like a lot of these guys, very mixed person. Now, with the Reformation quickly spreading, another king embraced it, this time being Gustav Vasa. Born in 1496 after the coronation of Christian II of Denmark as King of Sweden in 1520, who executed several supporters of the Swedish regent Sten Sture the Younger, including Gustav's father, he led the Swedish War of Liberation and successfully ended the Kalmar Union between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. He was elected as king in 1523, and his conquest of Stockholm 11 days later ended the war with a Swedish victory. 4 years later, he introduced the Reformation to Sweden, confiscating the land of the Catholic Church and replacing it with the Lutheran Church under his own control. He raised taxes and replaced the power of local lords and clergy with state-appointed governors and bishops. In 1544, he also replaced Sweden's elected monarchy with a hereditary monarchy, thus keeping his House of Vasa on the throne for another 110 years. And because of all this, he has become known as the father of the nation. Now, another of Charles's iconic Protestant ancestors is William the Silent. He was born in 1533 in Nassau, Germany, and at age 11 became Prince of Orange and Baron of Breda. In 1551, he also became the Count of Buren, Leerdam, and Lingen, and Baron of Ilselstein, and became Count of Katzenelnbogen, Vianden, and Diez in 1559. It was also in this year that he acquired his first political offices, becoming Stadtholder of Holland, Zeeland, and Utrecht. In this position, he served the Habsburg as a member of the court of Margaret of Parma, the governor of the Spanish Netherlands. However, he was unhappy with the Spanish centralization of political power and the persecution of Protestants, and he joined the Dutch revolt that began in 1566, and which became the 80 Years' War starting in 1568. As the most capable and influential leader of the rebellion, he led the Dutch to several victories against Spanish, but lost his title as stadtholder in 1567. However, it was restored 5 years later after his replacement, Maximilien de Hénin, 3rd Count of Bossu, was imprisoned. After becoming stadtholder of Friesland as well in 1580, he was declared an outlaw by the Spanish king, and the following year he became the first leader of the newly independent United Provinces, which became the first Dutch Republic. He was assassinated in 1584 in Delft, but his leadership ensured eventual Dutch independence, becoming known as the Father of the Fatherland, and his descendants still rule the Netherlands to this day. Despite this, though, he was actually only 7.25% Dutch, and instead was mostly German at 84.25%. He was also 5.5% French, 0.75% Greek, 0.5% Venetian, 0.5% Ligurian, and 0.25% Swedish, Danish, Lombard, Piedmontese, and Emilian. Now, ironically enough, though, Charles III is also descended from Charles V's brother, Ferdinand I. He succeeded Charles as Archduke of Austria in 1521 and King of Germany 10 years later. 1526, after the death of the Hungarian king Louis II at the Battle of Mohacs, he became the King of Hungary, Bohemia, and Croatia. Finally, he became Holy Roman Emperor after Charles's death in 1558, and due to his flexible approach to religious issues, he was able to achieve more during his reign, which continued until 1564. He was just under a quarter French, 16% Spanish, 14.25% German, 11% Portuguese, 6.75% Occitan, 4.75% Aragonese, 4.5% Greek, 3% Dutch, 1.75% Lithuanian, 1.5% Jewish, 1.5% Cuman, 1.25% Venetian, 1.25% Polish, 1% Lombard, Ukrainian, and Sardinian, 0.75% Ligurian, Russian, Piedmontese, English, and Leonese, 0.5% Emilian and Swedish, and 0.25% Czech, Breton, and Serbian. So again, as with a lot of these Habsburgs, extremely mixed heritage. Another prominent figure of the Counter-Reformation was Mary, Queen of Scots, who got that title at 6 days old after her father's death in 1542, and so spent most of her time and childhood in France, where she married as Dauphin in 1558 and who would become Francis II of France the following year. However, his reign only lasted a year, after which she went to Scotland, arriving in 1561. 4 years later, she married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, but in 1567 his residence was destroyed in an explosion, and he was found murdered. Although James Hepburn, the 4th Earl of Bothwell, was the main suspect, he was acquitted and married her mere months later. However, this triggered an uprising in which Mary was deposed and forced to abdicate in favor of her 1-year-old son, James. After failing to restore the throne, she went to England to seek protection from Elizabeth I of England. However, her arrival threatened Elizabeth since she was a claimant to the English throne and was seen as the rightful queen by many English Catholics. Because of this, Elizabeth had Mary confined to various manors and castles, and after 18 years she was found guilty of plotting to assassinate her in 1586 and was beheaded. Interestingly, she was half French, almost a quarter German, 3.75% Occitan, 3.5% English, 3.5% Dutch, 3.25% Welsh, 2.25% Greek, and was only actually 2% Scottish. She was also 1.5% Venetian, 1.25% Neapolitan, 0.75% Italian, Cuman, and Swedish, 0.5% Spanish, Ligurian, Piedmontese, Kashubian, and Ukrainian, and 0.25% Lombard, Danish, Emilian, Aragonese, and Swedish. Now, her son, James, although not that well known, was an extremely important ruler. Now, at age just 1, he became James VI of Scotland after his mother's abdication, and the regents ruled until 1578, although he didn't gain full control until 1583. 20 years later, after Elizabeth I's death, being childless, James succeeded her as King of England and Ireland, being a great-great-grandson of Henry VII. After this, he moved to England, returning only once to Scotland. Despite that, he was relatively successful there, unlike in England where he faced several issues, including the gunpowder plot by Catholics to blow up the Parliament in 1605, as well as several conflicts with the Parliament. Despite this, his reign saw a continuation of a golden age of literature and drama created by people such as William Shakespeare and Francis Bacon, and even writing books himself. The most well-known book of his, though, is his translation of the Bible into English, which still bears his name, the King James Bible. He had an important legacy being the first British monarch, which would eventually lead to the formation of Great Britain and the United Kingdom, and was the first English ruler to successfully create colonies in the Americas, leading to the creation of the global British Empire and the eventual establishment of Canada, the United States, and several Caribbean countries, And finally, he oversaw the plantations of Ulster, which created Northern Ireland. After his death in 1625, he was succeeded by his son Charles I. He was 43% French, a quarter Scottish, 13% German, 4% English, 3% Welsh, 2.5% Occitan, 2.25% Dutch, 1.25% Greek, 0.75% Venetian, 0.75% Irish, 0.5% Neapolitan, Spanish, Italian, Swedish, and Cuman, and 0.25% Ligurian, Piedmontese, Kashubian, and Ukrainian. His daughter, Elizabeth, married Frederick V of the Palatinate, who became Elector Palatine in 1610, and whose mother was the daughter of William the Silent. He got thrust into the spotlight in 1618 when the Protestant Czech nobility of Bohemia rebelled against their Catholic ruler, Ferdinand II, Holy Roman Emperor. As a result, the nobles asked Frederick to be their king, which he accepted, partially because he was already the leader of the Protestant Union. However, his reign would not last very long, and just a year and 4 days after being crowned, he would be beaten at the Battle of White Mountain and deposed. He was then forced to flee to the Netherlands, and he lived the rest of his life in exile until his death in 1632. He was 47.5% German, 21.25% French, 6.25% Occitan, 5.5% Dutch, 3% Lithuanian, 2% Venetian, 1.5% Greek, 1.5% Breton, 1.25% Belarusian, 1.25% Ligurian, 1% Czech, 1% Emilian, 0.75% Piedmontese, Russian, and Swedish, 0.5% Lombard, Ukrainian, Danish, Polish, Bosniak, Cuman, and 0.25% English, Portuguese, Spanish, Kashubian, Sorb, and Italian. Once again, it's only getting crazier over time. So anyways, that is all for this episode. I hope you found it interesting. Certainly a lot of major Reformation and Counter-Reformation figures that King Charles is descended from. Anyways, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and I will see you next time.